This is Cold Start.
So today's episode, we found something a little interesting in the archives. Todd's Dream Garage from 2015.
Yeah, I was digging through my Google Drive and I found this 10-year-old document. It's actually older than that. It started in like 2011, 2012, but the last revision date on it was in 2015. So this was my idea of my dream garage 10 years ago. The cars I kind of wanted, or I thought maybe at some point I'd try to get.
So I thought it would be pretty fun to go through this list, top to bottom, and maybe talk a little bit about each car, how it made it onto the list, if that car has been checked off the list, and maybe some of the stories that those cars bring up for you.
I can imagine some of them would be pretty embarrassing, but yeah, let's go through them. I'm curious to see how many of them would still hold today, how many cars I would still want versus how many of them I thought was a good idea at the time and just really isn't.
And looking over this list, it's a pretty wide variety of cars. So I think it's going to be really interesting jumping from one to the other. And, there's some obvious answers on this list, but there's also some very unique choices.
Yeah, I think it speaks to, I don't know, any real car geek, I think, has a pretty wide range of the kinds of things they like. And so at least I thought that about myself. So it's kind of an eclectic list. There's a lot of different things on here.
Well, so starting off with probably the heaviest hitter, in my opinion, on this list, which is a 2011 Porsche 997 GT3 RS 4.0.
Yeah, might as well swing for the fences, right? That's the first item on the list. I really wanted that car. By the time I started making this list, I had acquired my first and I think second Porsche, 997.2 turbo and a 993 turbo. So as I started down that path of, I think we said in a prior episode, like once you really go into Porsche, you become sort of a scorekeeper and you have to like tick all these boxes. Well, the ultimate expression in my mind around that time was probably the 997.2 GT3 RS 4.0. So that was my first one on the list. And interestingly, in the time since this was written, I actually acquired one of those. I found a car in Europe that was a driver's car. I didn't want a collector car, and these have become collector cars in the U.S. If you try to find one of these now in 2025, they go for like $800,000. It's kind of crazy. So I thought I was smart. I found one in Europe that met all my criteria. It was a black one, which is harder to find than the white ones. It was a driver. It was a one-owner car. It was bought and serviced by the same dealership. It was the Porsche Stuttgart, the sort of flagship dealership in Germany where Porsche headquarters is. And so I found this car and I thought I was super smart. I was going to import it to the US, and there's a process for doing that. I did some research and I thought, okay, let's go ahead and do that. And it didn't quite work out. I tried for well over a year and a half to import the car. I worked with these independent certified importers companies that are where you're supposed to go to get this done, and none of them could make it happen. This was post-COVID when I was trying to import the car and just couldn't get it here. So I wound up owning it for several years and keeping it in storage, at first in France and then in Switzerland. And I never actually got to put hands on the car.
Really?
Yeah, which is sort of both disappointing and embarrassing and all those things. Like I owned the car, but sort of in name only. I had pictures of it and all of that. And I went through all the process of sourcing it and keeping it, but I never got to use it. And I didn't manage to get over to Europe. So eventually I sold this car. So it was kind of the one that got away. I achieved the dream of having it, but I never got to touch it. So it was really disappointing. And I know that sometime in my future, if not that exact car, something like it will still be on that list.
I mean, it's like getting the fish on the hook, but not in the boat.
Yeah, it came off the hook just right before I pulled it in, So yeah, there's still a story to be written there, TBD.
Massive dream car, and seems like it still is.
Yeah, it was the last manual RS car that Porsche made. The 4.0 engine was an amazing thing at the time, built on the Metzger engine, the race engine that was the sort of forebear. The 997.1 era sort of ended that. And just sort of a halo car in its own right. And it's become very well known, but at the time it was still a little bit of a, nerd Porsche niche kind of a car. So it was something I really held in high regard and I'd hope someday I could have. So I got so close, man.
Hopefully it's not the end of the story. Hopefully maybe in the future something like that will come back around. So moving on down the list, so the next three vehicles are BMWs. But the next one is 2004 BMW E46 M3 Coupe.
Yeah,
Parentheses, not the convertible.
yeah, well, I had an E93 M3, which was the E92 hardtop convertible. I went through a stage. I like convertibles, but I'm no longer seeking those. I just don't really roll with those. So, yeah, at the time when I wrote this list, the 2000 early 2000s era, the E46 M3s, I still think are probably one of the best looking M3s ever made.
Yeah, super iconic.
Super iconic. This is a car that I could say I did acquire. My good friend and I kind of went in on this car together. We found one for sale down in SoCal. We drove down and bought it from this dude, and he had it sort of set up for the track. And our goal was to turn it into a track car, a quote unquote track car. Over time, what happened was it really became my friend's car more than mine. And he continued to convert it to the point where it became really a race car. It was barely usable on the street. He had a bunch of the interior ripped out. It had that big honking CAE shifter. It was a great car for racing on the track, but it was a very, very poor car for driving on the street anymore. And so we did own it. I did get to drive it a couple of times, but it didn't quite satisfy the itch, I think, if you will. Every time I still see an E46 M3 out there, I still have that feeling like, oh man, that's so cool. Maybe I do want one of those again. But having gone through the process, I would not make it a track car. I would just keep it a street car and enjoy it for what it was built to be.
Maybe a little bit of a throwback to our track cars are stupid episode and why maybe sometimes we think track cars are stupid. I think in that situation, I would agree with you that the E46 M3 is such a great car. And I think in its street form or like OEM plus street form might be a little bit more rewarding than stripping it and caging it. And I remember that car, it had a rare interior for the BMW nerds out there. It was a speed cloth variant of the E46 interior. So it wasn't like the special M colored speed cloth. It was like the more laid back black speed cloth, but still a rare interior for an E46, which got stripped out of this car and racing seats put in and harnesses and all that sort of stuff. So E46 is a race car. Awesome, right? Very, very good, but taking away from that street car experience.
Yeah, we even found the slick top, right? The one without the sunroof, which is harder to find, so that we could turn it into this track car. And, it became a race car and it was really no longer good for the street.
All the BMW purists are crying a little bit right now.
I know.
So moving on down. So another BMW, still in that early 2000s era, probably the sister car to the E46 M3, which is the E39 M5.
That was kind of like the more grown-up car, right? It was a sedan, so you got these extra two seats in the back, the two doors. That car, the looks of it, I think it was probably the pinnacle or the peak of that M5 design. The first one was obviously in the late 80s, came out, so they had refined it a little bit. It was prior to the point where Chris Bangle and those later guys got their hands on it and really ruined the design of those cars. It was fast. It was good looking. It was kind of the ultimate all-arounder. And for me, they always look really good in dark colors. So I thought it was like really like the ultimate badass street car, sedan car, something that you can use in a lot of different circumstances. It was fast. It never meant to be a track car, but that was something it held it in really high regard, and I always kind of wanted one.
The M5 was always like the bad guy's car in the movie, especially in those darker colors, black or something like that. I mean, M5s in general have a great reputation, and I think the E39 can be argued to be one of the best M5 generations. I mean, all of them came in manual transmission, right? You didn't even have an option for an automatic.
Yeah, that's right.
They came with that nice, naturally aspirated V8 engine, timeless design. It had enough curviness to it, but was still mainly boxy. It still had that like good early 2000s BMW design.
Yeah, it was a departure right from the six cylinders, which BMW's become pretty well known for. So the V8, that was pretty cool. They did that whole series of BMW films in the early 2000s, sort of like you said, the bad guy or like the driver with the skills was behind the wheel, and there was some circumstances that they had to get them out of. And those were really cool and influential to me. And so that car was one up on a pedestal, and I still haven't ticked that box, but who knows what will happen.
So going off of the M5 being such a great car in general, the next car on the list is another M5, but this time being the E28 chassis code. So the very first M5 ever.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of referring back to. I always thought that car looked like, I'll sound funny, but like super goth, right? Like it only came in black. It was a 1988 car in the States. It came out a few years earlier in Europe. It had these lines that were just sort of like angular and like all down to business. They had a kind of a dark look to them. Frequently you'd see them with the tinted windows too. So they just kind of had that menacing sort of a sinister look to them, which I really liked. And they were same kind of thing, right? Manual only. This was a 6-cylinder, true to the BMW history. And it was the first M5 ever produced, right? Like there wasn't that model before that. There were 5 series, but they came up with this special sort of like sport line. And really cool things about that car, you flip open the hood and you see on the engine, you see M Power sort of, embossed in the side of the engine. It was an engine that looked like it meant business too, right? Like
There's no plastic valve
no,
covers.
no, all like mechanical linkages, and like it just looked like it was down to business. It had great power and great agility for a sedan at that time. I mean, I can't think of any other 4-door kind of like, supposedly family car sedan, driver like that had that level of power and that level of handling for the time. I've always liked that design. It's something I always wanted to go back to. The US cars had these kind of funny bumpers. They referred to them like the diving board bumpers. There was this extra stuff that protruded out on the front because in the mid to late 80s, there were a bunch of like safety regulations that were put in place. So all cars have to have these, they called them impact bumpers. So they could withstand like a 5-mile-an-hour bump or something like that. And they just look kind of funny, but the ones in Europe didn't have those. So a lot of people would convert them to the Euro bumpers. Or they had this one conversion that was really interesting, the California bumper, where they would drill into the little valves or like the piston that would be actually the spring between the bumper and the car. And it would release a bunch of fluid and then they'd push the bumper in. Like some people would actually drive it slowly into a wall to push the bumper in so that it looked more like that Euro bumper. And I don't know, they're just cool cars, There's something about them that was just, they had a mystique.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm a big BMW guy. I've always liked BMWs. And I never really gave the E28 much thought until we started having conversations about it. And the more that I looked into it, I was like, wow, how could I have overlooked the E28 M5? It's basically what started the performance sedan market. It was the first ever performance 4-door. And obviously been great successions since then. And another cool note is that engine was directly plucked out of the M1. It was the M1 motor, a little bit detuned, right? Making it more family friendly, but such an amazing car and such a fascinating history of it coming to the States. And like you mentioned, only one color. You could only get it in black when it came to the US. And it was a single year car too for the US. Only 1988.
Yeah, that's right. We talk a lot about this idea of the race car for the road that people think they want, but they don't really. Well, the M1 was a race car. It was homologated. It was a street car as well. But they took that engine, they detuned it, they put it in this family sedan. People could barely believe it, right? This thing had almost 300 horsepower, which at the time,
huge,
enormous, right? Now that just sounds like funny. Like you could go buy like a Civic Type R has like 300 horsepower or something like that.
Or Toyota Camry,
right? But at the time, it was one of these like off the charts numbers. This car was almost as fast, or maybe was as fast as like a Porsche 911, as these other performance cars, and had 4 doors. It was just so cool and so different. That's why it sort of held a high place for me and was so high up on this list. And it's a car I still want, if I could find one that was the right condition and the right circumstances. They'd have a lot more miles on them. They would have a lot more wear, but I can imagine rocking one of those and really enjoying it.
Oh, absolutely. All right, switching gears a little bit. The next one is going to be a 1998 to 2005 Acura NSX.
So this is another one that I actually did acquire. I had a 2001 NSX, and I picked that year specifically because it was right before they got rid of the pop-up headlights. And I thought that was so like era specific, and it was a really good look for what they called the NA1 Acura NSXs or Honda NSXs, depending where you're from. I had one that was in black, and the story behind that was it was the late 20-teens, and I was just starting to go on the hunt for a Carrera GT. I decided that was a car that like it came and went, and I missed it, but I have to find a way to acquire one. So I actually started working with a broker to try to find one, and I put a search out. I wanted a black one. I wanted a driver car. I didn't want somebody's collection car. And he looked for me for like almost 2 years and couldn't find me the car I wanted. So at some point I said, look, this isn't going to work. I kind of took my retainer back from the broker, and I decided as a consolation prize to myself, I'd buy this car that I decided was sort of like the poor man's Carrera GT. If you look at the lines, hey man, you look at the lines from the side, there's actually some echo, if you will, from the NSX to the Carrera GT that kind of scoop out along the side of the door, the mid-engine quality, the things that lit me up about the Carrera GT, I could sort of convince myself were in the NSX. And of course, we all know about that famous video with Ayrton Senna wearing like loafers or moccasins or something at the track.
Oh, yeah.
The close-up of his feet, he's dancing on those 3 pedals, making that NSX look amazing. So I was so excited to get one. I got it. I had a cool plate on it, I have to say. My plate was VTEC Yo, and that was pretty popular around town. But I have to say, driving it, it didn't meet my expectations at all. First of all, I was a little big for this car, right? I'm a big dude. I'm like 6'3". I was well over 200 pounds at the time I was trying to drive this car. I couldn't find a way to get comfortable in the seat. I could push it all the way back. There weren't good adjustments for like height and stuff. And like, I just always felt like I was sitting really high. And the glass on that car, the front windshield, is sloped down really far. So I had this really weird perspective looking like over the dashboard, out the glass, feeling like I was riding up high in this car that's made to kind of be slumped down and driving low in. And it was old suspension. Like I found a really good example. It had just over 19,000 miles on it when I found it. And I never wanted to buy a collector car, one that I couldn't go out and use. So I drove it anyway. I cleared 20,000 miles on the thing, but it was in such good shape and so original, I didn't really want to modify it. And it needed a different suspension. It needed a different tire. It needed a bunch of stuff because it drove like a car from like 2000. And this is in 2020 or so. And it just didn't really, I don't know, scratch the itch for me. The funny part is, in the process of acquiring this NSX, the broker got back in touch with me and said, hey, I found a car for you. And so I did wind up acquiring the Carrera GT. So I got the NSX, then I got the Carrera GT, and it was hard to go back to the NSX at that point, especially when it didn't kind of meet my expectations in the drive and the feeling and the handling that I thought it would have. It was a cool car. You could push it hard once you get into that VTEC Yo, like 5,000 RPM. The engine sounded good. It could move, but it just wasn't anything. You couldn't hold a candle to a Carrera GT by any means. But it just was that early 2000s Honda, which was a cool car, and it looks great. But it didn't quite meet my expectations, so I only had it for a few more years before I went ahead and got rid of it.
I think you might be the only person to ever compare a CGT to an NSX, but no, that's awesome. That's a great story. And yeah, I feel like there is a piece of that, of these cars that are from, decades ago. You have these ideas of how amazing that they're going to be, and then you drive them and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. This is an 80s, it's a 90s car. Like even when we were talking about the E28 M5, like in its period was a fast and phenomenal car performance-wise.
Amazing.
Nowadays, yeah, if you compare a 80s BMW, it's not going to feel blistering quick. And maybe same sort of situation with the Acura NSX of, yeah, during its time period, it was this phenomenal car of those late 90s, early 2000s. But then when you start comparing it to modern day vehicles, they might come up a little bit short.
That's one of the things about, sort of nostalgia and retro, kind of looking back at cars, is they were cool for their time and they had certain qualities that by current standards don't quite maybe live up to those things. You enjoy them for other reasons, right? You enjoy the drive, not the power. You enjoy the overall experience, not the handling. Tire technologies come a long way. Braking technologies come a long way. So they're still cool, but they don't retain all those things that we thought of, like, when we were kids or when we were a lot younger. What those cars were is not what they are now.
All right, keep moving on down the list. So next car is a Nissan 240SX Koki style.
Yeah, well, Sylvia, I guess most people call that. I actually had one of these cars, and I was the canonical guy who didn't know what he had. I had a 96 240SX SE. It was black. It had some cool details on it. It was a really fun car to have. I had it when I lived in Florida at the time, and I remember driving on I-95, which is sort of like the equivalent to 101, I guess, on the West Coast. And in the pouring rain, that car, I don't know if it was a combination of tire, rear-wheel drive, whatever it was, man, that thing was hard to handle. I would hydroplane, I'd be sliding all over the place in that car. Little did I know later on that would be like the drift car extraordinaire that people go out of their way to kind of go and take out and like totally kid out as a drift car now. But at the time, it was just a cool little sport coupe. It wasn't even that popular. People are like, oh, one of those? Yeah, I guess they're okay. They look all right. I think the looks on them has really held up over time. And if I could find one today that was in good condition, that wasn't all clapped out because it got turned into a drift car and slammed into the K-wall 50 times, I think I'd still want it, but I think it would have that same problem as the NSX. It was no NSX, don't get me wrong. It was a lot lower, a lot more economical car than that. But I think it wouldn't kind of translate to, the experience I've had through cars, more recently. But I still think it's a looker. I still think it's a cool design that was sort of overlooked at its time. I think I think we'll come back to this and say, wow, we didn't realize what a good looking car that was. And I think that might even be a trend of other cars on this list as we go further down.
Keeping with the JDM theme that we got going on, the Mazda RX-7, the FD chassis.
That was another car that everybody slept on that thing. When that first came out, I'm like, my God, that car is gorgeous. And I remember it came out, I want to say there was this like dark green, almost black color that got popular for a few years.
Oh, yeah.
The Acura Legend was known for having that color. I don't even know what they called it, but it looked so good on that FD. Other colors too, but just the lines, the kind of rounded, swooping lines, a really tasteful little spoiler on the back. It was just a cool looking car. Nobody thought anything of Mazda really at the time. Rotary engines, nobody wanted to deal with that kind of stuff. It just seemed like something different. It was a pretty economical car at the time too. It wasn't expensive. Nobody thought of it alongside the other cars that you might compare it to, like the Toyota Supra of that era. Nobody would have compared the Mazda RX-7 to that car at the time. And where it came from was, it started out as kind of an ugly looking car, right? It kind of had like not as good lines as like the old 240 or 280Z. Mm-hmm. And it was, again, weird, and it was a Mazda, and nobody knew the Mazda brand really in the US. So it was kind of this like weird stepchild car. And it was the third generation of it, right? Or maybe the fourth. The FC that came before it is now pretty well known, and I think you see those around. But this car looked so good. I didn't really have much experience driving one or being in one, but I just knew the way it looked was sort of timeless. And even in my much younger mind, looking at that car, I said, that's something that we're going to look back on and say, yeah, that was something special.
Well, it's interesting because I think people nowadays looking at an FD RX-7, they're like, yeah, that's a cool car. I want one. If there's one that's like well sorted, still super OEM and original, they're going for a significant amount of money, And what's funny is back then when those things were new, Mazda actually cut it short in the U.S. market because they weren't selling well.
Yeah.
They didn't come to the U.S. market until a couple years into their production, and I think they were only in the U.S. market for 3 years, and then Mazda's like, okay, no one in America wants them. Let's stop shipping them over there. And nowadays everyone's like, oh, I gotta have one. It's so cool.
Right. And again, that limited production makes them even more in demand now, right?
Yeah.
Like people can't find a good one because there were only so many of them made, right? Same thing with that M5 we talked about, the E28, right? 1 year only. If you didn't get it, that was it. And how many survivors are there? How many that didn't get turned into somebody's project car or whatever? With the FD, it was exactly that. And I still think they look great. I think if the right example came by, I would look at it. It probably wouldn't meet all my expectations in terms of the drive or the power or the handling, just like these other cars from that era. But it's still, I think it's a timeless look. Like that would be a cool car to do a fun engine swap, I think.
And now the next one, so it's a Porsche 914-6.
The Porsche 914 was sort of this really lightweight car that they did, I think, in partnership with VW, Volkswagen. It was weird looking. It was kind of like square and notchy looking, very, very low slung kind of car. It's another way is like I barely would fit in one of these cars just because they're kind of short. And they came out with, I think it was only for 1 year or 2 years, this 914-6, which was the 6-cylinder version of it. Mm-hmm. So for such a small car, it was just over 2,000 pounds, which if you think about now, a road car, just over 2,000 pounds. And now you throw a 6-cylinder in it. and you put a Porsche label on it, that's just like catnip, right? You want something like that. It was cool looking, and it had some weird, quirky technology. One of the things a lot of people don't know about that car is the way the windshield wiper fluid worked. This sounds like a weird thing to geek out on, but the windshield wiper reservoir, instead of having like a compressor pump or something that would add a bunch of weight and might not fit in this little car that was a mid-engine car, it had a connection to the spare tire. So that when you pulled on the stock to, get the windshield wiper fluid squirting on your windshield, it would actually release a little bit of the air from the spare tire to like push the fluid out. So you can imagine, like, if you use this too many times, you'd actually be deflating your spare tire while you're just trying to like squirt the windshield wiper fluid on your windshield. I just think that's weird in that way. That's completely about function, not at all about form. It wasn't really a good idea. I still don't think that's a really good idea. That's not a car I think I still, would want today. But again, when I wrote this list, 2015, 2016, and when I originally created this list, I had just gotten into Porsches. So it was kind of this, mindset of collect them all,
Yeah, I feel like the 914 is kind of like, it's the cheap Porsche. Because it was more Volkswagen than it was Porsche. And I don't know. I was never a fan of the 914.
I remember in high school, I had a band director who had one of these 914s. And, high school teachers don't make a lot of money, right? So, but somehow this guy went out and got a Porsche. And I was like, whoa, what is this thing? It's a 914. Hey, how come it looks and sounds a lot like a VW?
All right, getting back into the JDM sphere, a 1983 Datsun 280ZX.
Yeah, well, I had an 85 300ZX, which was so like of its era kind of a car. I had that at the end of high school. It was such a cool car. It was way more car than I needed, and it wasn't that much car to begin with, let's just say. But my dad had one in the early 80s, a 280Z. It was cool. It was sort of Nissan's sports car. They hadn't come out with the GTR. They hadn't gone into that direction that they eventually went with a much more powerful 300ZX. It came from that, origin of the 240Z back in the day, and it was an evolution from that. It's not a car I still want. It's something the lines were kind of interesting and quirky. I think it kind of looks like sort of maybe like reptilian now. Mm-hmm. It's a weird look. It had T-tops, which was a really weird technology. So
T-tops are so cool.
Oh, T-tops, man. It's like if you couldn't get a convertible, which we've talked about before, if you couldn't get a Targa top, a full lift-off roof, they had these T-tops where it was just like a partial sunroof over your head where you can take the tops off. It wasn't as good as a sunroof. It wasn't as good as a Targa. It wasn't as good as a convertible. It was this weird in-between because you had to store the tops. So like your limited cargo space now has these two like roof panels hanging out. It was a weird design, but something about it at the time, the nostalgia I think took over and made me kind of want one.
Well, fast forward. Doesn't the CGT have T-tops?
It sort of does. It's sort of between a T-top and a like a Targa roof, right? Uh-huh. They do connect in the center, but it comes off entirely to be a full roofless car. Mm-hmm. In a way that back to that NSX, right? The NSX had that removable kind of Targa top as well. So there's something about that keeps coming back for me. It's maybe a little beach cruisery. I always imagine like the perfect place to drive would be cruising down PCH. Maybe you're like in Malibu or driving some twisties. Something about the T-tops gave me a little taste of that.
All right, so now we're getting into like the weirdness, which I think everyone listening right now needs to bust out Google because I don't know what this is. I had to Google it myself. It's a 82 to 88 Aston Martin Lagonda.
Okay, so talk about weird-looking cars. There was something about this car. So Aston Martin made this four-door car. Everybody thinks of Aston as a two-door, as a coupe, that had the weirdest lines on it. It had this long, sloping hood, these weird headlights, like these kind of teeny tiny square headlights all in a row. The thing about it that made it make the list to start off with was the interior. It had the craziest dash and steering wheel and like console and everything. It looked futuristic, kind of electronic. It looked like nothing else that came before it, and I think pretty much nothing else that's followed it. By all accounts, it was considered a pretty ugly car. Even that name, Lagonda, like what is that about, right? It wasn't something that was to be held in high account or high regard. I think most Aston Martin aficionados were like, what is this monstrosity? What is this thing that's been created? It didn't last much longer than, a couple of years it was out, maybe 5-6 years. It's no longer something I want. I don't even know why I put it on the list to start off with. It was just weird and underappreciated, and it had the cool dash and like digital display and stuff like that, which was so 80s.
Yeah, it looks like they brought back the name of Lagonda for their newer four-door version of one of their cars. But looking at photos right now, just to paint you guys an image of what the old 80s Lagonda looks like. So the nose of this is twice as long as the trunk and as long as the passenger compartment. Then you look at the interior, and it's almost like the Citroen style, where it's like you only have one spoke to the steering wheel, but it's a massive single spoke, and the instrument cluster almost looks like a control room flat screen.
Mission
like
control.
Massive.
Yeah, like NASA designed this or something. And this was way before screens, right? We're talking early to mid 80s.
Yeah, no, this does look like modern day cars, of how they're starting to do that like super, super long infotainment screen.
Right.
This almost looks exactly like that. So if you don't know what an S-Smart Lagonda looks like from the 80s, Google it. You will not be disappointed.
Yeah, you'll have plenty of stuff to make fun of me for.
So keep in the same category of interesting designs, 1970s Cadillac Eldorado Coupe.
Yeah, this is another nostalgia play, right? In the 80s, my mom had, I think it was a 77 or a 78 Cadillac Eldorado Coupe. This thing was so long, like you could play like a regulation game of football on the hood of this car. It was enormous. And I remember one of the things, my little sister went to this school that had these gates near the entry, and my mom hit those gates like 3 or 4 times with this car because it was just so big and so long. And it was just like overscale, like 70s excess as it was approaching the 80s in a car was this car. And there was just something about it. It's the ultimate land yacht. It was the Cadillac version of that. So it was kind of like the highest level American car version of that you could get. Something about it. I remembered riding around in that car, seeing ones like that. Later on, there were some movies that started to try to make those cars look cool. So I don't know. For a little while, I thought that would be fun. I think, and then the reality of living in the city, living in San Francisco, I'm like, how would you possibly have a car like this? It would be impossible to find parking for, to just even get around town. It was just a bad idea. I don't know what I was thinking.
It still has a fun experience to it. Like, we're talking about it now. It's like, who doesn't want to cruise around in a Cadillac Eldorado Coupe? Like, you're going to feel like somebody. Maybe not somebody of this era, but you're going to feel like somebody.
Yeah, I feel like you should have some like gold chains and your shirt like unbuttoned like halfway down your chest, and it kind of has a little bit of that. It's a little bit of that like loungy kind of a vibe, very Vegas-y or kind of like New England-y in a way. Not something I'm really leaning into right now, but I could see where you could appreciate those things if you're into that.
All right, so moving on to some Americana. Now we're getting some good U.S. vehicles. I'm going to group these two together because similar silhouettes, but it's the 85 Chevy Monte Carlo SS and 86 Buick Grand National.
Recently, rappers found the Grand National, and it's like become this big iconic thing. It's on a bunch of album covers and videos. But yeah, I had a friend whose dad had a mid-80s Monte Carlo SS. I thought the thing was badass looking. It was kind of notchy and squared off like a lot of cars in that era. You know, the Buick Regal, that sort of was the forerunner of or predecessor of the Grand National, had that same kind of look to it. It was a sporty coupe. I always like sporty coupes. There's a recurring trend on this list if you hear a lot of sporty coupes. It was Chevy, and they did this car well. They came up with a good design for it. You know, it was pretty powerful given all things considered at the time. And it was like a pretty within reach car. Like, it wasn't so expensive. I couldn't ever imagine getting one. Like, Corvettes were starting to get kind of expensive, and they were a super powerful sports car. This wasn't like fully a sports car. It was sort of this like sport coupe, and that really resonated with me. I didn't want the one that had this thing called the Aero Coupe. The back windshield sort of like, I don't even know how to describe it, like bent out. It was like a trapezoid or something. It was the glass itself that popped out, so it gave it a really weird look to it. I like the one that was more like the notchback regular kind of model, whatever the Monte Carlo SS was. Another nostalgia play too. My dad had a late 70s Monte Carlo, not the SS. It was nothing like an SS. It was not a luxurious car, but he was proud of it, and we used to rock around in it. I think it was like burgundy with white interior or something like that.
Great color combo.
Oh, totally, right. So yeah, one of these Monte Carlo SS or Grand Nationals in black. Again, sinister sports coupe. I could see rocking around in one of those. The engines sounded good, right? Kind of the power plants on those things were pretty cool. But yeah, that's probably a car for a prior era. I'm not sure I'd be looking for one of those these days.
Yeah, I wonder if talking about the Aero coupe, I would bet that being in the 80s, Chevy probably did that for NASCAR to get the aerodynamics of like for the super speedway car. Like that was back when being a stock car in NASCAR, they actually had to produce it to be able to put it on their race cars.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, it was just weird and quirky. Nothing else looked like that, and I know I didn't want one, and I still don't.
Yeah, the notchback, like the squared back on the Monte Carlo, super, super iconic. So back to Porsche now, a 928 GTS.
Yeah, this is, well, you got to collect them all kind of mindset of the scorekeeper being a Porsche geek. The 928, of course, was the front-engined Porsche that came out in the 80s. It was known as such an expensive car. I think the top-of-the-line 928, the GTS, when it came out, I think it was like $80,000 in the 80s, which was just crazy insane. And this was that specific model, right? The GTS, which is like the sporty model. The things I remember about it, it had these pop-up headlights, but they were like a bug-eye looking headlight. Like, you remember the bug-eye Sprite cars? It reminded me, so growing up and born in the 70s, there was this cartoon where there was this like brought to life, like anthropomorphized dune buggy that had these bug eyes, and he'd go around driving, and he was like Speed Buggy, I think he was called. And it just like reminded me of that, plus Porsche. It just seems so cool. But no, it's not a car I still want.
Yeah, no, very interesting car. Back to the JDM stuff. So 3000 GT VR4.
Yeah, Mitsubishi was one of those cars where in the early 90s, my then girlfriend, now wife, had a Mitsubishi Eclipse. And for those of you who don't know, the Mitsubishi Eclipse was a shared platform with Chrysler. They called it Diamond Star Motors. So there were three cars that looked pretty much the same, all on the same platform. It was the Mitsubishi Eclipse, the Plymouth Laser, and the Eagle Talon. And good luck finding any of those on the road anymore. But those cars had a higher end version, like the Mitsubishi had like a sportier model still that they called the 3000 GT, and the VR4 was the ultimate expression of that with the cool spoiler. And it was a car that was a little bit out of my reach price-wise when they were around. They were big, and in particular, they had a hardtop convertible. Oh man, this keeps coming back. But the Spider convertible version of that weighed almost 1,000 pounds more than just the regular coupe, which is just crazy and idiotic. Like, why would you want this 4,000-pound car just because it had a convertible hardtop compared to the regular coupe that was like in the 3,000 to 3,200 pound range? It was just nuts. So no, that's not something I still want. I think there has been some appreciation for those cars. Their looks harken back to, what was the car that we said looked kind of like it? It was a Dodge Stealth, I think.
Oh yeah.
Maybe they shared a platform too, back to the Chrysler kind of overlap with Mitsubishi working together for a while. But no, that's not a car I still want. I don't know what I was thinking.
This might be the classiest car that we have on the list. 93 Cadillac Elante.
Oh man, so I think that was the opposite of class, at least considered at the time. The Elante was sort of a boondoggle. Like, Cadillac really like failed with this car. There was a whole series of these that Cadillac was just not in a good place in the early 90s. There was the late 80s, even the Cadillac Catera. I don't know if you know about that. We're not going to talk much about it, but if you've never heard of that, Google Cadillac Catera. It looked like, I think it was a shared platform with the Chevy Cavalier, which was not a luxury car and was not a classy car. The thing about the Elante that was cool were the lines. Like, the design of the body was super, super cool. It turns out Pininfarina, right, who's known as this coach builder, this Italian coach builder who's done a zillion Ferraris and really like gorgeous cars, designed the body of this car. They built them in Italy and they imported them to Detroit, and then they put this like kind of crappy engine in it. It looked good, and now, for a little while, I think when I wrote this list, they were thought of as like this old person's car. They weren't thought of as a particularly good car or classy car, but they just had cool lines and almost like a Mercedes. There was sort of a look about them that I thought reminded me of maybe a 90s SL in a way. There were a lot of convertibles around of those. Again, I was sort of into that for a while. Just something about it looked really good. Now you can get them really cheap. That's another one of these cars, I think, if you did an engine swap, that might be something that'd be kind of fun to roll around in, but good luck finding one in good condition and that you'd actually want to drive.
This is another one of those cars that I've never thought about until I saw this list and I was like, oh, I have to Google it. Like, what does it look like? I agree with you. There's something there. Like, if you could find a pretty clean Alante and like slam it, it would be pretty slick. Like, it's so boxy and the lines are so simple. It's cool. Now, you talking about the motor, that's the only unfortunate piece of this, and that's why I started laughing is I looked up the motor that was in it because I was like, it's probably the North Star V8, isn't it?
The North Star, yeah.
If you guys do not know the aura around the Cadillac North Star V8, on YouTube, watch the video about the North Star. It's hilarious. The motor was terrible. I mean, it would explode. It's one of those things, if you ever find a Cadillac and it has a North Star, if it is running, it won't be for long. So, no, I feel like if you could find like a clean Alante, engine swap it, something simple, something easy, maybe just pop in like LS3, something like that.
Yeah, you'd have something. Maybe put on some 22s.
It'd be a pretty cool little cruiser.
Yeah, they look good. It was all about the looks. It was nothing about the engine. Let's move on.
All right, so finishing off the Lotus Esprit.
The Esprit was one of these like really wedge-looking cars, like especially the late models. They had a really pointy front. They were really low slung. Lotus was known for this car, right, where Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus, had this idea like add lightness, or simplify and add lightness was his quote. So the cars were kind of all that needed to be there was there. These cars looked kind of cool. They were very like late 80s, early 90s in the way that they looked, just in the qualities of them. Like the taillights were kind of boxy on them. And I think later on, there was this movie with Sharon Stone where she and I think it was her girlfriend were driving them around and they had matching Lotus Esprits and they were just kind of cool. I don't know. It was just kind of a neat car. I guess now I don't really want one, but like when I see one, I stop and I look. Like they still kind of catch me and they have kind of a unique look to them.
No, absolutely. It's kind of that iconic sports car wedge shape of the era where it's like super pointy front end, and the earlier models were a lot boxier than some of the later models into the 90s. You get a little bit more curvy bodywork that I think everyone kind of separates the 80s to the 90s of. The 80s is all about boxiness, right? And then the 90s came along and things started rounding out and getting a little bit more elegant. But I feel like both versions of that car are iconic. And I'm the same way. Like, you rarely ever see one, but when you do see one, you're like, oh, it's one of those. Like, I want to check it out.
I got to check it out, right? Yeah, and I think it was actually Basic Instinct. Maybe was the movie that they were driving those cars around. I don't remember. It was so long ago, but I remember thinking, Sharon Stone was kind of hot, and these cars were kind of cool looking, so it was all right.
No, it's pretty cool to look at this list, and like some of the cars that I would say like are quote unquote eclectic, or like not a lot of car people or standard car people would really think about or give a second look. If you compare a lot of them, like similar sort of styling characteristics, like that kind of weird Aston Martin to the Alante to even the Esprit, like you can look at all those cars and be like, I can see similar sort of styling, and the styling characteristics are very much of the era of 80s and 90s, and it was this like different time and cars just looked a little bit different. And I think a lot of things from the 80s and 90s and even into the early 2000s, that there's a lot of things that are enticing about those cars from those eras, whether it's being nostalgic that there was relatives, family members, friends, whatever it was, or being in high school or young and looking at these cars and aspiring to have one. But even looking at the design of it, of nothing looks like that nowadays, or nothing drives like that nowadays. And I think that's a big piece of it too, is even though we kind of touched upon it earlier in this episode that these cars aren't going to live up to modern cars numbers wise,
right?
But the driving experience is unmatched. And I've owned some cars from the 80s, 90s, in early 2000s, and 100% you drive one of those cars drastically different than anything you can buy from the showroom today.
Yeah, they're so involving, right? Everything was mechanical. There was very limited electronics in these cars. It was before the sort of regulations drove what the cars looked like the minimum heights for headlights and all these kind of things. You had things that were on the car for because they look cool, because the design was a certain way that people really, it really resonated with people. And then, just over time, things sort of evolved and changed. And there was something about these eras, right? Like there's something to look back on and I think to be fond of and enjoy them for what they are. The problem is when you try to enjoy them for what they were, it doesn't quite match your current perception.
Right.
But that's part of the charm of old cars. You go back and you have a feel from a prior time. You don't try to bring the current time into that.
Right. And I think like the technology piece that you're touching on, cars today are better forms of transportation, but they're not necessarily a better driving car or a better car for the driver. And I think us as car people, what makes us enjoy a car is that we get to drive it. And there's an experience that we have as the driver driving it. And modern cars are trying to eliminate that element of it of, no, this is just better to get from point A to point B. It's more comfortable. There's more safety features. There's all these things, which there is a benefit to that, to the market, but not necessarily for the individuals that are looking to have an experience and memories in a car just beyond going from point A to point B.
Yeah, let's talk more about next time how that era was so special and what was it that made that period in time and those cars from that period in time, different than all the others.
Well, thanks for listening. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Sylas.